A faint green hush hangs over the dark, and I invite your eyes to rest there. Let your shoulders soften. Let the room be ordinary and quiet while the sky does its slow work. We'll spend the night with a traveller that doesn't belong to our neighbourhood, a small body from far beyond the familiar paths. I'll keep the pace even and the tone low, guiding you through its light, its breath, and the gentle arithmetic of its motion. Nothing urgent here, only patient noticing. Before we drift, a simple arrangement. If you like, place your phone on Do Not Disturb, lower the brightness, and listen with comfortable headphones. If you're already drowsy, let your eyes close when they wish, but never while driving or caring for anything that needs your full attention. If this story helps, there's a quiet playlist of longer pieces waiting for another night. You don't have to go anywhere. The story will come to you. I'll speak as one voice, steady as a dim instrument at the edge of a star field, returning again and again to what we can see and what we can gently infer. Where numbers would usually crowd in, I'll keep them to their corners, letting the glow do most of the talking. You can breathe with the rhythm, in for the green, out for the dark, in for the soft outline of a coma, out for the wide, calm distance. The frame cools by a shade. The green hush softens toward blue, and we follow the light as it thins to a quiet thread, ready to begin. Let the gaze start at the dimmest point you can find. A grain of green, hardly there, nested among ordinary stars. Follow its outline, not with effort, but with a resting eye, the way you might trace the edge of a quiet lake at dusk. The light is patient. It waits for your attention to arrive and soften. We skim along the faint halo that gathers around the core. It is not a line like a trail on a map, and not a flare like a beacon. It is a hush in the shape of light, a small bloom that lifts against the dark. I guide you clockwise around it, 12, 1, 2, sliding across the thin glow until the rim looks almost like frost on glass. The stars behind it hold steady, while this visitor leans forward through them. If you pause here, at the northeast edge, the brightness dips just enough to reveal the sky as structure, not emptiness. You can see that the halo is lopsided, a little fuller to one side, as if light itself had chosen a shoulder to lean on. That asymmetry is common in small, active bodies. Outgassing and sunlight work together, tilting the daylight side, thinning the night side. We don't have to name the gases yet. It's enough to note the contour and let the shape tell you it's breathing. Down along the lower arc, the glow feathers into the background. Your eye may want to sharpen and hunt. Let it do the opposite, soften and accept. The more you relax the focus, the more the pattern appears. A core, a veil, a field of fixed points around it. This is how we meet a traveller from outside our neighbourhood, not with trumpets, but with a gradual recognition that one point is not like the others. I keep your gaze moving because motion is the second language of light. We pass the core and drift outward by a few seconds of arc in the mind's frame. The halo thins, then fades to where the sky takes over again. Notice how the field behind remains unchanged. Only the modest halo steals a margin of contrast. In surveys, that margin is a signature, too fast across the grid or carrying the wrong curve of speed, and the software raises a hand. A human looks, then another. What matters first is not the story, only the light behaving slightly out of place. Lift the eyes now to a wider circle. All around are the quiet custodians of the frame, the instruments on their mounts, the clock in the corner, the breath in your chest. We are watching the simplest version of a difficult thing. The light arrives as photons in an orderly line. The detector gathers them. A catalogue whispers which points belong to our star, our planets, our familiar comets. The halo we're following does not fit the familiar family perfectly, and that is where curiosity begins. If you lean into the core again, you might sense a softness at its center, as though something beneath the surface is seeping and repainting the edges. Small bodies do that when they warm, even slightly. Ice near the skin sublimates, becomes gas, and carries dust with it that scatters sunlight. From our distance, it reads as glow. Nothing dramatic, just light behaving, as if it had learned to breathe. And in the far cold, even a whisper of heating can carve a visible sigh into the dark. We circle once more, slower. The arc at the upper left shows a very faint trailing extension. Not a tail yet, more like a thought the halo is trying to finish. It's easy to imagine the rest. It's better to keep the imagination gentle. The physics prefers patience. When the sun angle shifts, when the rotation presents a new patch, the brightness will stir, settle, and stir again. Overnights, the position against the stars will right a curve. Fit that curve, and the path reveals how tightly or loosely it is bound to our sun. The binding tells us whether the traveller belongs here at all. There is a kindness in letting the image remain still for a full minute. The room grows ordinary. A faint fan hums. Your breath sets the only tempo you need. In that steadying, the halo's character becomes clearer. Not a glare, not a spike, but a shy increase above background, a small cup of light cradled by the field. It is the kind of feature that can be missed on a hurried night and unmistakable on a calm one, when your attention is allowed to widen rather than chase. The light says what it can. It says, I am moving relative to these stars. It says, I change a little when warmed. It says, I carry a skin that frees dust, and the dust makes me easier to see. From such small statements, a whole conversation begins. We do not need to settle the origin here, or the ratios of ice, or the history between stars. We only need to accept that something from far away is crossing our picture, and that light, patient and even, will let us read its intent if we stay with it. When you feel ready, pull back from the core and let the field take the frame again. Stars return to being the many, and our traveller returns to being the one. The halo now is simply a suggestion against the wide dark, and a suggestion is enough. It is the proper scale for a first meeting. The eye remembers where it sits. The mind remembers how it moves. The body remembers that the sky is not urgent. If we go on together, it will be by following this same modest guidance, a quiet halo, a steady breath, a willingness to let light teach without hurrying us. The green loosens toward a paler blue, the rim thins, and the frame cools by one more shade, like a page turning in slow light. The room speaks first. A compressor lowers its voice. The dome mutters across its bearings. The camera cooling line breathes. Between them, a softer rhythm emerges. The detector's gentle cadence as each exposure drains to the controller with a faint, regular hush. I count the seconds by ear, not because timing is secret or severe, but because the song of the system tells me where we are in the night. The soft ticking steadies the spine. A frame arrives as voltage and becomes an image. Stars present themselves as tidy points. Our traveller is a slightly stubborn one, round enough to be a point, yet not quite sitting still between frames. A centroid routine measures the face of each star, then tests the stranger the same way, and the numbers become positions on the sky. Plate solutions fold the field to a map, time stamps attach like quiet labels. Uncertainties ride beside them, small and honest. We listen as the readout whispers through the cable, line by line, until the whole rectangle of night is accounted for. Names do not begin with poetry. They begin with bookkeeping. A provisional tag is shaped from the calendar and the discovery stream, a practical handle so that hundreds of eyes can hold the same thing without dropping it. Circulars go out. The minor planet center gathers the coordinates, threads them into an orbit that is more sketch than portrait, and asks the world for more points. Each contribution arrives with its own hum, the tone of a telescope across an ocean, the cadence of another clock. The soft ticking becomes a chorus. We are cautious with conclusions, but the measurements teach by their own rhythm. If the curve that fits those points refuses to close, if the energy refuses to be negative, if the eccentricity glides beyond one, then the mathematics suggests a long, open path, rather than a bound ellipse. No drama, no breaking of rules, just a clean description of motion through the sun's domain and out again. The word for that path is hyperbolic, and the community has a way to say it plainly when the evidence is strong. Some words change the room. Candidate is one of them. Interstellar is another. When they appear together in a sober note, the request for time at larger mirrors becomes easier to hear, because the name carries a shape and a need. It tells schedulers what scale of attention the object may deserve. It reminds follow-up teams to lengthen their sequences, and, though no one says it outright, it promises that the night's quiet work will echo farther than usual, across instruments and latitudes and weeks of sky, until the object has either proven its long escape or settled back into the family of the bound. The camera answers without sentiment. A new exposure begins. The shutter's soft leaf sighs, and the chips accept more starlight in their ordinary way. I tend to a short list you can almost hear: bias, dark, flat, pointing, focus. Not glamorous words, but they keep the song on key, and they are the simple reasons why positions line up and uncertainties shrink. When the images meet a quality gate, I post the measurements, and in some distant office, another listener fits them into a growing arc. Between beats, we sip water, check the sky for thin cloud, and scan the queue for any voice asking politely to be moved up. The night has a patient etiquette. If the arc tightens and the numbers keep their story, a new label may be minted, one that does not depend on month codes and survey tags, but on a short count of how many wanderers from outside have come before. It is not a headline, it is an index. It tells telescope operators which scripts to pull, which filters to warm, which spectrographs are worth a turn at the object before dawn. It tells the analysts to open the non-gravitational drawers and the polarimetry notes. Most of all, it tells us what not to say. Not that the visitor is strange beyond science, not that it promises revelations on command, only that its motion places it in a class with a special kind of question. There are other sounds that matter, and none of them are loud. A chair slides as someone yields their slot to a colleague at a different longitude. An email chimes gently, not to alarm, but to pass on a plotted path that arcs a little higher, a little surer. A small fan trembles at one corner of the rack and seems to agree. I think about the kindness of clear letters in a long chain, each station careful, each observer modest, so that a traveller from another star can be discussed without heat, only with fidelity to what the sky is actually doing in these hours. That too is a name of sorts, a reputation we build for the work, one quiet report at a time. By the last set before the meridian break, I can almost predict the pitch of the readout by glance alone. The image fills like a bar of soft percussion and drains the same way. We have enough points for the night. The halo remains a touch brighter on one side. The motion is clean. The log carries a real, clear handle that will let other instruments find the same light tomorrow. I note it, save, and breathe with the gear as it rests. The room settles back into its bass tone. The shutter lowers, and, ever so gently, the spectrograph ticks once. Why would a small body begin to breathe when the sun is still a far, pale coin in the sky? The soft answer is that not all ices wait for warmth in the same way. Some let go earlier. Some slip to gas with only a little light on their skin. Water is a patient solid. It clings until the heat is more generous. Carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide are less stubborn. They are the easy threads in the cloth, ready to lift with a cooler draft. When sunlight reaches a dark, porous surface, it can warm the upper grains just enough to free those lighter volatiles. Dust rides along, scattering light and sketching a halo that looks, at first, like a shy thought around a point. Ask the second question with me. Does this early glow mean anything more than temperament? It can. The character of the breath hints at what is woven into the surface and what lies a little deeper. If the first stirrings are dominated by gases that leave at low temperatures, we begin to suspect a composition rich in carbon-bearing ices. It is not a verdict. It is a thread we can follow with care. We've learned this by watching comets closer to home. A spacecraft once lived beside a small nucleus and tasted its air as seasons turned. When that worldlet leaned closer to the sun, water grew loud. When it turned back to the cold, the lighter species mattered more. In both phases, the surface behaved like fabric under tension. Stiff in places, loose in others, stitched with tiny seams where vapor could find an exit. Those seams are the reason a coma can look lopsided long before there is a dramatic tail. Another gentle question. How would we tell carbon from water by light alone? The tools are kind. Carbon dioxide leaves a clear imprint near 4.26 microns, a bend in the spectrum that very sensitive instruments can hear. Carbon monoxide has its own quiet sign near 4.7 microns. Water loves many bands and often shouts in the near-infrared, or with a whisper of OH in the ultraviolet, after sunlight breaks it apart. Pair those signatures with color and polarization, and the picture tightens. What would make a traveler carry so much carbon ice? In young systems, chemistry sorts itself by distance and temperature. Near the star, rocks and metals dominate. Farther out, water settles. Farther still, carbon species freeze with ease. Disks around newborn suns have shown us these patterns in outline. A mosaic of rings where snow lines drift, where carbon to oxygen ratios vary, where grains grow and gather and inherit the flavors of their lane. If a fragment is born in the coldest ring, and later flung away It may keep that cold recipe, rolled into a small, fragile body that drifts for ages between stars. The cloth metaphor holds for another reason. Fine grains and porous ice make a good insulator. A dark blanket at the surface can trap a little warmth beneath, the way a quilt holds the night's heat against your hands. Under that blanket, a wave of temperature moves slowly into the material, just millimeters at first, then centimeters, each day's sunlight adding to the last until a seam opens and a jet escapes. And in that subtle sequence, the coma learns its uneven shape. Not because the body is dramatic, but because thermal change in porous media is unhurried and deeply local, a process that favors patience over spectacle, while still producing measurable, repeatable light. It helps to return to the image. The halo you saw earlier is the visible end of a process that can start astonishingly far out. A dark surface absorbs. A little warmth sinks in. Frosts rearrange. Carbon-bearing ices reach their comfort threshold and depart. Dust, entrained in the flow, becomes the needle that embroiders the glow. When we say early activity, we are really saying low-temperature emissaries have longer leashes, and those emissaries tell us about the stockroom of ices inside. Could this pattern belong to an interstellar visitor rather than a local one? Perhaps. If the composition looks unfamiliar, if the ratio of carbon-bearing gases to water is higher than we've grown used to, then the woven trace we're seeing may reflect a different nursery. Not proof, but a strong suggestion that the cloth was cut in a colder tailor's shop under a dimmer lamp, with different balances of carbon and oxygen, and with a timeline that allowed delicate ices to settle and stay. We do not need the ledger of exact numbers tonight. It is enough to know which questions lead gently to better measurements. A spectrum sensitive to the mid-infrared, or a log of how brightness changes with the angle of sunlight. A note about how polarization shifts as the phase grows and shrinks. Together, they turn simple light into a record of chemistry and texture. If carbon is the early singer, the song will be heard in those bands. If water is the later chorus, we will hear it nearer to the sun, and the whole piece will sound like a layered score, stitched by heat and time. Let one long, easy breath settle the room, and imagine that breath traveling inward through a crust that was welded by eons of radiation, across pores lined with frost, until it reaches a pocket where carbon dioxide waits at the edge of freedom. And as the tiny pressure gathers and the seam parts, the faintest exhale begins. A moving, translucent thread that rises, carries a whisper of dust, and drifts into the sunlight, where it writes a halo. You can see without strain, coaxing your eyes to rest while telling you, in the simplest possible language, that this fabric remembers a colder loom. When we ask, we answer softly. Early breath can mean carbon leads. A cool halo can mean a woven trace beneath. Instruments can hear what our eyes only sense. The stitch becomes a line, the line becomes a pattern, and the pattern becomes a story we can test with care. One gentle night at a time. That is enough for tonight. 01:47, the air inside the dome is cool and steady. The field holds still, while the faint visitor ripples almost imperceptibly, as if a pale mist had thickened for a heartbeat, and then thinned again. I note the time, center the aperture, and let the exposure run. The sequence is a postcard from a quiet hour. One frame, then another, the soft green trace breathing in light. Brightness does not wander without a reason. As the body turns, the face it shows to us changes, and so does the scatter from the dust that rides its breath. A lopsided shape, or a patchy skin, can make the curve of light waver, while small vents add their own rhythm, pushing vapor like small bellows under a cool dawn. The result on our screen is simple: a rise, a rest, a fall, a rest. Over nights, those rises align into a period. Rotation and light live together in this way across many comets. When the aspect broadens, the curve swells. When the narrow side turns, it sinks. If jets are present, they modulate the signal again, misting the profile with small pulses that ride on the larger wave. We do not need equations to feel it. We plot brightness against time, fold the plot on trial periods, and listen for the curve that clicks into place with the smallest scatter and the calmest line. There is another gentler lesson from a different traveller. Years ago, a long, lean object passed through our system and drifted away, leaving a faint, steady push not explained by gravity alone. The leading idea was a soft recoil from something it released, a persistent sigh rather than a burst. Whether that was gas or a more delicate process remains open, but the handbook grew a new page that night. Light curves and motion can carry the fingerprints of breath we do not directly see, and small forces can matter in open paths. Outgassing turns rotation by tiny degrees. Vents act like thrusters, nudging the spin faster or slower, changing the angle so that different patches face the sun and their own thin weather. We watched that dance up close around a familiar nucleus once, and saw its period drift as seasons passed. The mechanism was ordinary and beautiful, vapor escaping along cracks, dust rising like cool fog, the body's turn adjusting in answer, so that the light we measured through a telescope many millions of kilometers away looked like a breathing sheet of mist laid across the stars. Comfort returns as the sequence deepens. I widen the aperture slightly and take care with background subtraction. The curve becomes smoother, and the small pulses show themselves more plainly. If the period is there, we'll not hide. It will simply ask for patience while we gather enough hours to separate rotation from the slow swing of geometry, while we remove the long slope of phase angle, while we let the thin atmospheric seeing of Earth even out, so that in the end what remains is intrinsic, an honest ripple drawn by the turn of a chilled, dusty surface that exhales in patterns set by pores, seams, and the slow warmth of sunlight moving through a shallow skin. And because that skin is porous and dark, the heat wave travels inward only by millimeters each hour, laying down a schedule of release that our photometry can trace if we give it the night it needs. What then do we test next? We can try a period search that respects gaps and uneven timing, a method that prefers the music of the data to the grid of the clock. We can split the curve by color to see if the mist is the same across bands, or if one wavelength thickens when another thins. We compare the light curve with polarization at a few phase angles to learn whether the scattering fog is composed of finer grains when the brightness swells, or coarser ones when it rests. Each addition is small. Together, they tell whether the change comes from bulk rotation, active vents, or both. I mark another postcard hour, 02:03, and close an exposure that carries the same quiet story. The rise is modest, the rest is long, the fall is patient. On a damp night you might see fog breathe between lampposts. In the same spirit, the coma's glow around this traveller deepens and eases. along a tempo we can fold into a single turn, and then use to predict how the line will look when the night returns. The clock at my elbow ticks once, and the next frame opens. I note the time again, and at 02:14 the room remembers how to breathe. The night has a low rustle, the dome's slow swivel, a cable relaxing on its hook, the soft hush of fans stepping down a notch. Far outside that small machinery, the sky feels quieter still, as if the stars themselves had chosen to breathe in. I let the room settle until the only rhythm left is yours and the faint tick of the clock, and in that hush we begin to trace a path. We do not guess the path all at once. We gather positions that are modest and exact, then lift them from the mountaintop frame into the solar frame, and from there into the calmer arithmetic of the solar system Bearii Center. Night by night, each point joins the last, and the curve becomes a track. Once the track is clean enough, we let an integrator run time backward. The traveler leaves our neighborhood in the equations, slides past the shepherding of planets, and enters the slower sway of interstellar space in the model, where even small uncertainties keep widening like a road that forks again and again. The widening matters. Measurements are never perfect. A milliok second here, a second of timing there, and the future and past both bloom with possibilities. So the origin is not a dot. It is a cone of maybes that stretches away across the local neighborhood. We can still ask useful questions inside that cone. Did the inbound speed look ordinary for a visitor not bound to the sun? Did the direction on the sky pass near any known streams of local motion? Does the traveller's approach line up with nothing in particular, or with places where ejections are common? The outskirts of young systems, the rough edges of binaries, the busy lanes around forming giants. We ask, then test, then ask again. Stars do not sit still while we do this. They move on their own errands, proper motion across our sightline, radial motion toward or away, so we pull their positions and velocities from catalogues that have watched for years. With those 6 number stories in hand, we let the same integrator play every star's film backward too. If our traveller's cone brushes past any star within a plausible distance and speed, the notebook earns a cautious circle, not a declaration, and the work turns to narrowing the cone with better astrometry, better modelling of tiny forces, and patient coordination so that small, careful observations outlast the temptation to rush toward a tidy place name. The reason anyone thinks a cone might point to a nursery at all comes from the way small beddies are cast out. In young systems, giant planets patrol the outskirts of disks, and their gravity can scatter icy fragments outward forever. In clustered births, neighbouring stars offer tugs and jolts. In binaries, the dance is rougher still, with resonances that fling debris into interstellar lanes like missed steps in a crowded hall. Ejection speeds are not theatrical, often just a few kilometers per second added to whatever the system is already doing. But over millions of years, that is plenty. A fragment becomes a Voyager, and a Voyager becomes part of the background traffic between suns. Chemistry can hint at birthplace too, and those hints are maps of their own. Disks around young stars have snowlines that drift with time, nearer in for water, far out for carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide. In some regions, carbon outnumbers oxygen. In others, the balance flips. Radio arrays have drawn these contrasts as rings and crescents of gas and dust. If a traveller wears the signature of a colder ring, more carbon-bearing ice, less water on first warming, that signature narrows the cone, not to one street, but to a neighbourhood, a district of conditions that leave the same kind of mark on whatever is thrown free. Let the room go quiet again for a minute. A thin tremor in the air from the cooling loop. A distant door settling in its frame. Your breath rising and falling in time with the slow sweep of the telescope as it tracks the sky. We are tracing a road we cannot walk, but the quiet helps. It turns guesswork into listening, so that the map grows only where the sky is willing to draw it, and nowhere else. There are gentle, practical ways to make the map finer. Longer arcs before and after the point of closest sunlight reduce the sway of small, unmodelled pushes. Photometry paired with dynamics catches signs that the path is being tugged by its own breath and lets the software subtract that tug. Higher precision positions from more than one observatory break the small biases that come from a single horizon. And if the light can bear it, spectra and polarization tell us whether the dust and gases fit better with a colder nursery stock or with the warmer pantry near water's line. Each upgrade is a step on the same slow road. We also check the background traffic. The sun and its neighbours orbit the galaxy together, and the local standard of rest gives us a way to talk about motion that isn't only about us. When we transform the inbound speed into that frame, we can see whether the traveller rides with the usual flow or arrives at an angle. None of this makes an origin certain. It makes it reasonable to say, these lanes are busier, those are quiet. These birthplaces cook carbon into solids farther out. Those keep it in gas until late. It is the kind of map you carry not to arrive, but to walk a little wiser. By the end of the session, the curve is a little cleaner. The cone is a little narrower. Somewhere in the dark beyond the planets, the model's line passes between stars that have their own small cones pointing toward their own beginnings. It is humbling to notice that every path is a summary of many older paths, of tides in disks, of encounters in clusters, of long galactic drifts. If our traveller came from cold, the signature will persist. If from warmer lanes, another one will. And in the quiet between exposures, with the map hovering on the screen like a pale thread across black, I let the sounds of the room take over. The slow air, the soft fans, the subdued click of an idle keyboard, and a low hush settles between instruments, a slow breathing of metal and night. Begin as small as possible. One dust grain unmoors. Gas lifts it like a gentle swell under a skiff, and the sun presses with a steady push. Gravity asks it back, radiation urges it outward. The grain tilts a little, then commits to the slow tide of dust that drifts from the nucleus into night. Close enough to feel the push, the physics is simple and kind. Tiny grains, lighter than sea foam in this thin harbour, answer the sun more than the pull. They veer quickly, brighten sharply, and thicken the near horizon around the core. Larger grains, closer to pebbles than spray, keep more loyalty to the path of the traveller. They hang in its wake, reluctant to be scattered, forming a sheet that remembers the orbit like a channel remembers a keel. The tide is slow. The map it draws is slower still. Step out a pace. The coma is a road of many travellers. Sub-micron motes make a soft glare, efficient scatterers that paint the inner waterline bright. Micron. Grains carry the glow outward, smearing the sheen into a broader reach. Millimeter pieces barely answer the solar wind at all. They settle into a plane like silt, falling through quiet water. If the body keeps releasing them over days, that plane becomes a flat, pale current through the sky, best seen when our viewing deck crosses the same level, so the sheet aligns edge on and turns from surface to line. Sail a little farther in thought, and you meet a line that points the wrong way. It is not a rebellion. It is perspective. When Earth crosses the traveller's orbital plane, that slow tide of heavier grains, still loyal to the path, draws a narrow wake that seems to point sunward. Long ago, a bright visitor showed this clearly. A silver thread laid along its lane, and the effect has appeared since in others when geometry, grain size, and timing agree. There is comfort in that agreement. The sky behaves like water under patient forces. Lines that look odd are currents seen from the proper rail. Now return to a single mote and watch how it glints. Composition matters to the colour of the wake. If carbon-rich dust rides the tide, the grains can carry broad bands in the infrared, a faint perfume near 3.3 microns that signals aromatic structures born in cold kitchens and warmed by starlight. Such grains are small and tender to light, more fog than spray, and they thicken the inner shine even when the gas is modest. If rockier fragments dominate, the scatter shifts, the wake brightens differently, the tide writes in another hand. We read by accumulation, by nights that let tiny differences add up, like swell upon swell, until the pattern holds. Widen again to the work. With high resolution you sketch the near hull, the cusp, the inner glare, the first meters of tide. With large, steady mirrors on the ground you chart the long water, the faint sheet, the hinted line, the reach where the wake turns to silver. Between them, the story of grain sizes and launch speeds resolves, and with it, the reason a line can seem to ignore the sun while obeying simple currents. For every frame adds to a logbook that records how dust departs, how quickly it spreads, and how faithfully it keeps to the vessel's course, even while the finest spray blows free in a bright arc. And because the log is kept across colours and angles, the numbers ride calm seas of correction, until what remains is the quiet shape of a tide that began as single grains and ends as a chart a whole skywatch can follow without haste. Rest here. Hear the almost nothing of the room, like a harbour after the last boat ties in. Your breathing marks the swell. The image holds the line. A note in the margin reminds us that plane crossing seasons come and go, that a simple change in the viewing deck can turn a sheet into a blade, that this is navigation as much as it is light. If you're drowsy, let the mind drift with the wake and keep only the gentle rule. Small grains bloom. Close, large grains draw lanes. The tide is slow, and slowness is kind. We sketch a plan as the night deepens. Short exposures near the core to trace the bright spray. Longer ones to net the faint sheet. A sweep through infrared bands where carbon signatures hum. Then a step back to visible light to hold the overall form. If a line sharpens that seems to point the wrong way, we log the sun angle, the plane angle, the hour. We compare to past wakes drawn by other travellers, testing whether this tide, too, carries heavier grains that keep to the lane. The notes align, the profiles stack, the wake grows clear, the numbers steady. And, if sunlight leans across a dark, porous skin, then warmth draws a shallow path through it, more a thread than a tunnel. If that thread reaches a pocket where frost sits close to freedom, then vapor unlaces a seam and slips outward. If a seam opens in the right direction, then the exhale tugs on the body that stitched it, ever so slightly, and the spin answers. We follow those gentle ifs because they turn a distant blur into a fabric we can read. Heat does not rush through this cloth. It strolls across the topmost grains, sinks by millimeters, and pauses at each bond to negotiate its next move. The distance it travels in a day is a shallow measure. Call it the skin of warmth. Beneath that skin, the deep stays patient. Above it, the surface knots and loosens with each arc of the sun. When the warm layer reaches a pocket, the vapor inside finds a narrow hem and begins to pass. Dust rides along, and the passing writes a thin plume on the sky. If the plume emerges from a slope that faces the dawn, then its push lengthens the day's spin. If from a duskward hollow, the push can slow the turn. Most of the time these nudges cancel over a full rotation, but not always. Patterns matter. A few persistent seams on one hemisphere can add their tugs like repeated stitches in the same direction. Over weeks, the period drifts by minutes, then steadies again when the light shifts and another set of seams takes over. We notice this in comets we could linger beside, where every jet had a personality, and the clock it tugged kept polite but noticeable time. Texture sets the timing. A crust that is compact and dark absorbs quickly, but gives little back. A looser weave soaks the warmth and lets it move deeper before it escapes. Grain size, porosity, and a dust blanket's thickness all change how far the daily thread of heat can travel. Sometimes the thread reaches a lens of ice only at local noon, sometimes just after, when the surface already cools, but the subsurface still remembers. The breath that follows those rhythms shows up in our data as a soft, stitched pattern, a base wave from shape and rotation, embroidered with small pulses that arrive at the same rotation phase for nights, and then drift as the sun's angle changes. If a seam seals itself with refrozen grains, the plume falls, silent. If a fresh crack opens, perhaps because yesterday's exhale removed a little support, then a new stitch begins, and the light curve grows a tiny tassel at the edge of its main pattern. These are not explosions. They are careful alterations to a garment under gentle stress, hems that part and close at the pace of heat and shade. On fast nights, we speak of outbursts, but in truth, most are whispers, short-lived increases that reflect sunlight from a newly freed spray of fines. The word is only a label. The mechanism is slow work. Our tests follow the cloth. We can model a rotating shape with a few bright or breathing patches and ask what light they would weave for us. We can let each patch respond to the sun with a delay that matches a certain skin of warmth, and then nudge the model so those stitched jets apply small torques back onto the rotation we assume. If the pattern we synthesize folds into the real curve with less scatter, we keep the stitches. If it frays into noise, we unpick and try another placement. And because colors respond differently to coarse and fine dust, we can add a thread for each filter to see if the pulses are woven from the same grains as the base glow, or from a finer yarn that lifts only when a seam is new. There is a courtesy to the physics that rewards patience. A night's worth of points will show a period, but a fortnight shows its drift. A handful of phase angles will show a rhythm, but a season shows how the rhythm answers changing illumination. A sweep of polarimetry will show how the grain weave shifts as different seams speak. Across those longer arcs, the most restful discovery repeats. Gentle heating, shallow penetration, localized exhalations, and the smallest torques are enough to embroider the whole record with changes we can trace. And when the body is small, and the jets are stitched in the same quadrant for a time, the clock they tug will wander by a little, and then wander back, as the sun walks to the other shoulder and warms a new set of hems, and in that wandering the curve learns to breathe in a way that feels less like noise, and more like a familiar garment flexing along its seams. If you wonder whether a distant halo can truly tell us about this weaving beneath, remember how often we have caught the same stitch in closer cloth. We have seen dawn plumes that always speak after a certain delay. We have seen midday seams that puff and rest as the heat wave dips and rebounds. We have measured slow, seasonal changes in spin from nothing more dramatic than repeated, directional sighs. The faintness on our screen is not a barrier. It is a soft filter that asks us to stack nights until the pattern holds. One session opens the notebook. Many sessions teach the fabric. When the model has the right texture, other pieces click. The small forces that act on the path itself become easier to separate from measurement noise. The curve of position along the sky tightens when we subtract what the stitch jets would do. The rotation period's gentle drift stops being a surprise and becomes a weather report for the surface. Today's seam's active, tomorrow's quiet, next week's moving to a new panel. If we are lucky with seeing and cadence, we might even hear a harmonized beat in color, the base cloth bright in one band, the fresh seam prominent in another, like warp and weft that cross and then blend. All of this returns us to a calm ending. If sunlight arrives at a low angle, then the skin of warmth deepens a touch. If a seam is ready, then vapor will unlace it. If a plume persists, then the spin will answer. If the spin answers, then our curve will show it. The chain is not dramatic, only honest. I set the pencil down and look at the trace one last time. The jets are not random. They are stitched, and the stitch jets return, softer than before. The room's hush settles first. The low fan, the faint air through a vent, the soft click of a relay finding its rest. For a minute, we let the quiet be the music, so the ear becomes steady and the eye follows. In that calm, we take 3 handrails, simple and strong, to carry us through what scattered light can say about dust. Handrail 1, the angle. When sunlight strikes a cloud of tiny grains and reaches us at small phase angles, the returning light can be polarized in a direction that seems to lean the wrong way. This is the negative branch, a reliable behavior of very fine particles seen at gentle geometries. As the phase angle grows, the sign flips and the degree of polarization rises toward a modest crest. If you picture the curve across angles, it starts below zero, near close alignment, crosses through, then climbs. No drama, just a soft, repeatable contour that lets us hear the orientation of the electric field. The way you might notice a whisper is sideways to the room. Handrail 2, the size. Sub-micron grains are good at this quiet trick. They scatter light with a preference that twists the returning wave into that negative branch near small angles and produces delicate degrees of polarization overall. Larger grains tend to flatten the effect or shove it positive sooner. In simple terms, the smaller the specks, the more the whisper leans. The larger the bits, the more the whisper straightens. Our measurements don't have to guess blindly. We record polarization at a few angles and watch whether the curve carries a deep, soft dip or a shallow one, whether the crest arrives early or late. The tone of the curve tells the ear of the instrument what sizes led the chorus. Handrail 3, the makeup. Dust that is rich in carbon, dark, absorbing, more soot than sand, often pushes the polarization toward modest values with a broader negative branch, while brighter, silicate-heavy grains change the line's timbre, lifting the degree at certain angles. To the eye, the coma may look nearly the same. To a polarimeter, the difference is a shift in the song's key. A run through filters can refine the ear. Blue light favors different particle responses than red. The near-infrared can turn down small grain features and lift signs of larger flakes. Each color adds a note. Together, they form a chord our models can tune. These 3 handrails are enough to walk. We can now explain why 2 comae of similar brightness feel different under the instrument's ear, and why the changes with time matter. As the body rotates, it can present regions that release finer or coarser dust. The negative branch deepens or relaxes in step. As the phase angle changes night by night, the whole curve slides along our angle axis, revealing the dip and crest at different places. If the object is carbon forward, the line will tend to be subdued, but stable. If it is silicate bright, it may show a slightly higher crest. Each possibility is a quiet voice. Together, they produce the signature we came to hear. I set the polarimeter to a simple cadence. Measure at one angle, rotate the analyzer, measure again, repeat until a full set completes. Then change the phase by letting the sky do its turn, or wait for the object to oblige. We don't chase big numbers, we seek steady ones. A degree of polarization of a few % is already a soft bell we can ring from the dark, and the pattern across angles is the melody. We pair the sequence with photometry so the volumes match. If brightness swells when polarization dips, fine dust may dominate. If both rise together, grain size or geometry may be shifting in another way. The instrument's ear works best when the metronome of the night is regular. A short aside for why negative means leaning, rather than anything alarming. Polarization is a direction game. The electric field of light prefers one orientation over another when it leaves a scatter. In backscattering at small angles, certain arrangements of tiny rough grains send the preferred direction parallel to the plane of scattering, not perpendicular. That convention gives us the negative sign. The physics is patient and cumulative. Many small forward and back throws from surfaces and voids inside the grains build the final tone, and because this accumulation is sensitive to size and composition, the curve becomes a modest fingerprint we can read without noise if we take our time and hold the instrument's hand steady for the span of the night. Rotation sets a second rhythm. Imagine a field of vents that release finer specks from one hemisphere and coarser ones from another. As the body turns, the local dust mix in the near coma changes, and the instrument hears it as a small swing in degree or angle of polarization at a fixed phase. If the swing repeats with the light curve's period, we know the source is tied to the surface. If it slides slowly with phase, and not rotation, we credit geometry. On good runs, we can separate the two and lay them side by side like tracks in a quiet recording. brightness on one staff, polarization on another, so their harmonies and offsets become obvious and kind. Color helps refine the ear. Polarization in blue often responds more strongly to the smallest grains, while red grants the larger pieces a little more weight. When we measure both and find the blue curve deeper in the negative branch, we hear a finer dust chorus leading. When the red is similar in shape and value, the sizes may be mixed, or the composition more absorbing. With an infrared note added, especially near features where carbonaceous bonds sing, the spectrum and the polarization together can suggest whether the dust is a dark soot-like mix or a brighter glassy one. And those suggestions point back to what temperatures and chemistries wrote the dust in the first place. On nights when the phase angle is small, I watch for the dip. On nights when the angle grows, I listen for the crest. Both are quiet. Neither needs to be extreme to be useful. The curve only asks to be coherent, and coherence is a gift of cadence and care. So we schedule the sequence early and late in the apparition, when angle changes are slow enough to map smoothly. We plan a few rotations worth of samples so any periodic swing can be found. We avoid bright moon and racing cloud, so the instrument's ear isn't asked to shout. And across weeks, the negative branch, the flip, and the gentle rise sketch themselves into a line that holds even when the coma thins, because the property we measure is a ratio, a direction, a quiet preference that survives where raw counts fall away. There will be a night when the dip is clearest, a night when the crest is kindest, and a night when both are only hinted. We keep them all. Then we compare to the library of other travellers whose dust we have heard before, not to force a match, but to place this new signature among familiar timbres. If the curve sits alongside the carbon-dark sub-micron choir, the inference is modest and real. If it tilts toward the brighter, broader chorus, we adjust our model of texture and origin. And if the signature changes with rotation, we smile. The instrument has caught a local solo, a patch of surface with its own dust voice, turning in and out of the beam with clockwork care, telling us about a seam, a pocket, a habit of release we could not see any other way, and telling us all of it in the softest register the sky can offer to a patient ear that knows what it is listening for. Because at scale, the physics of scattered light is a choir of small agreements that, when aligned, ring true across telescopes and nights and angles until they feel less like tentative notes and more like the quiet presence of a tone we can trust to lead us onward. Green arrives first tonight, a thin thread in the dark. It is not loud. It doesn't declare itself the way dust glare does. It simply lingers around the core, like a quiet line drawn by a careful hand, and once your eye accepts it, the rest of the frame eases into place. The hue is the guide. We follow the green. That color is the voice of a small molecule meeting sunlight. Diatomic carbon sings in the visible, with bands that lean toward green. So when parent gases are broken apart and the fragments bask in light, the halo picks up this gentle tint. It is not paint, and not a gimmick of the camera. It is an emission, energy taken in and then given back as a narrow melody. And when the night is steady, that melody threads the coma like faint silk in a dark weave. Color shifts with distance. Far out, when the warmth is only an idea, the green can be modest or absent, because the chain of breakups that feeds it has not yet found its pace. As the traveller moves toward the warm edge of sunlight, the feed grows richer, and the thin thread lengthens. Dust may also brighten, a soft grey that rides alongside. But dust's shine is broad and quiet, while the green carries a particular note that our filters can keep separate, so that one does not drown the other, and the story remains readable to a patient eye. Water's signature travels a different road to us. In the harsh part of sunlight, water molecules crack, and one of the pieces glows in ultraviolet, a tiny blue whisper well outside what our eyes can easily hold. We listen with instruments that can hear that pitch, and we use it as a proxy for water's breath. When those counts rise, we know the warmer layer has reached deeper ice and invited it out. The green shows the fragments of carbon at play. The ultraviolet shows the offspring of water's release. Together, they make a chord that tells us how the surface wakes. The sequence is layered rather than switched. Where carbon dioxide and its kin can stir early, they colour the coma in bands that appear even in the deep cold. Closer in, water begins to keep pace, and then, on some days, to lead. The thin green thread does not vanish when this happens. It weaves around the new brightness, a line through the thicker glow, letting us trace how one set of gases yields to another without losing the history of the first. You do not need to memorize wavelengths to follow it. You can simply let the color be a path that says who is speaking tonight. Observers translate that path into numbers with gentle care. Narrow filters isolate the green singer from the grey of dust, so its melody is not confused with reflected light. Other filters steady the continuum, letting us subtract what the grains contribute and keep the gas alone. The ultraviolet ear, often above the atmosphere, keeps time on water's quiet percussion. When the counts from these different windows are set side by side, a pattern grows. Green steadying, green rising, green held, while another voice swells and fills the inner coma with a brighter breath. Chemistry supplies the patience behind the scene. Parent molecules, simple, fragile ones, wander out with the flow and are split by sunlight. Fragments meet light and glow for a while, then fade as they drift outward and thin. New fragments replace them near the core. The green we see is not a paint shop turned on and off. It is a relay race whose baton passes invisibly, but whose ribbon can be measured if we let the exposures run and resist the urge to rush the record. Because the pathway from ice to gas to glow takes time, and that time is as much the subject as the hue we notice first. On some nights, the green leans against geometry. Phase angle changes how the light threads back to us. A modest tilt can lift or dim the view without any change in the gas below. We keep notes on that tilt, and on the rotation too, because a seam on one side may feed more fragments than a seam on the other, and the thin thread thickens as the active patch faces us, then thins as it turns away. The map of light and time and colour is a soft grid we lay over the image, so that each brightening earns its place, and no single frame is asked to carry more meaning than it can. If you picture the whole approach as a colour story, it unfolds like this. At the cold edge, grey dust speaks first when carbon-bearing ices let go and lift fine grains into sunlight. A little nearer, the green arrives as fragments take up the tune. Nearer still, the ultraviolet whisper of water's child begins to peep through the noise. Then, around the warm edge, the green and grey and UV each find a balance that changes by day and by rotation. and in the span of several calm sessions, we end up with a small atlas of hues that, taken together, sketches how heat travels the upper layers, how different ices answer, and how the coma's colour moves from suggestion to chorus as the sun leans in. Brightness alone can mislead, and colour alone can too. Dust can surge without a matching lift in gas, making the whole field look louder without changing what the molecules are saying. Conversely, gas can brighten while the dust remains modest, colouring the halo without thickening it. This is why we listen with two ears, one tuned to the narrow melodies of emission, one to the broad light of reflection, and keep both honest with calibration that hums the background and gives each count a quiet, reliable weight. Plans for the warm edge are modest and thorough. We schedule sequences that hop among filters without losing cadence. We make sure the ultraviolet watcher has clear time. We keep a short run in a red continuum band to support subtraction, and we sit long enough to catch a full rotation in case colour swings with the curve. Then we fold nights together and watch how the thin green thread holds or relaxes, how the blue whisper rises and fades, how the dust glow plays steady or changes only when a seam opens. The practice is unhurried, the kind that teaches by repetition, and by the end the frame feels less like a snapshot and more like a quiet time-lapse in colour, where the physics is simply the patient changing of light. Let the image rest. Now. The core keeps its small authority. Around it a soft grey lingers. Through that grey, the green traces a careful circle. Above and below, the ultraviolet cannot be seen, but is felt in the counts we trust. The field is cool. The stars are steadfast. The thread thins toward a pale blue at the edge of the frame, then softens again into ordinary night, and the glow eases down to a final hint, like a green note held just until the air decides to let it go. We take a slow walk along a silver line. It begins as a whisper, laid across the field, narrow as a thread, and so steady that your eye might pass it by. It does not flow away from the sun as a tale should. It leans the other way, toward the glare, and yet nothing here is disobedient. We keep an easy pace beside it, the way you might stroll a pier at dusk, feeling the boards temper your steps while the water holds its calm. The line is dust riding a quiet current. The finest spray, light as foam, was blown outward long ago. You can't walk where foam has gone, only watch the bright haze it leaves. What stays is the heavier drift, grains that kept faith with the traveller's path. They slip from the nucleus with modest speed and almost no drama, settling into the orbital plane like silt in a channel. When our viewing deck crosses that same level, the sheet turns edge on, and the sheet becomes a blade becomes a line, and the line, by pure geometry, seems to point sunward. We pause over the water and look down. Imagine the vessel's wake, a broad, barely seen sheet that fans out behind it. If you climb a ladder at the right moment, the sheet no longer looks like a sheet. It narrows into a moving stripe that appears to aim where it cannot go. Perspective is the tide here. The dust did not choose a new rule. We chose a new angle. The silver holds steady because the lane it marks is the same lane the traveller keeps. Grain size sets the pace of the wake. Sub-micron motes answer the sun's pressure quickly and veer off like spray. They are the short-lived sparkle near the hull. Micron grains drift farther before they bow to light, brightening the inner water for a while. Millimetre pieces, dense and deliberate, keep to the channel. They do not rush. They form the sheet that becomes a blade when we stand just so. Their loyalty to the lane is why the line is thin and sure. Their modest birth speed is why it can seem to hold still over nights, even as the body moves on. We walk a little farther and listen to the low surf of numbers that makes this sight possible. The sky gives us angles and we write them down, the tilt between sun, object, and earth. The hour when our deck crosses the plain, the slow spread of dust as it falls behind. Photometry tells us how bright the stripe grows as we approach alignment, then how it thins when we pass through. Polarimetry reminds us that coarse grains whisper differently than fine ones, tilting the electric field one way when the sheet is thick, and another way when it becomes a blade. The change is modest, but faithful, like the soft clink of a halyard in a steady breeze. There are nights when the line is almost too polite. Thin moonlight lifts the background. A river of faint stars runs through the field. The silver seems to disappear. We shorten our stride and do the simple seamanship. Longer exposures to net the faint current, careful subtraction to remove the broader glow, gentle masks for galaxies that would counterfeit a stripe. The work doesn't need applause. It needs consistency, and the ocean of the sky rewards that. Keep cadence, and the line returns. Sometimes a visitor draws more than one wake. A bright ordinary tail points away from the sun, radiant with fine spray thrown free by gas. Beside it, fainter and thinner, the anti-tail holds its contrary grace. The two are not rivals. They are companions, written by different crews of grains, one blown downwind, one still sliding the channel. On rare, fortunate nights, the geometry is kind to both at once, and the field shows an angle between them that feels like a quiet compass rose laid across the dark, a reminder that motion here is many-layered, yet governed by a single, patient tide. We keep our walk near the rail and look for texture. If the silver is smooth, the sheet is old and well mixed. If it shows knots along its length, the traveller may have shed heavier grains in bouts, a row of small barbs that mark past releases. Those barbs drift slowly and preserve a simple calendar, and because their motion is loyal to the lane, a good ephemeris can measure them back to dates and longitudes on the path, letting us ask whether a pulse in light or a shift in colour preceded a thicker knot. The sea keeps logs if you know where to look. A long, even breath helps here. Let the room be the cabin of a night boat. A fan is a gentle wind over the deck. Somewhere below, a pump hums, then rests. Your shoulders lower with the rhythm that such machines allow. On the screen, the blade of dust has the stillness of a reflected mast in harbour water. Any tremble is seeing, any kink is cloud, and you know to wait those out. After a minute, the stripe looks steadier, and your notes do, too. You mark the angle to the sun, the distance from the core, the per-pixel brightness, and the narrowness of the line, small numbers, patient cadence. Perspective has its kindness and its traps. We remind ourselves that a line can widen into a sheet with a small change in stance, that a sheet can vanish when we slip off the plane, and that true motion belongs to the grains, not to our eyes. So we schedule 2 or 3 nights around the crossing, set exposure depths to hold the stripe even as it fades, and pair the images with a model of slow, heavy dust launched at modest speed. Then we let the comparison run until the position and thickness of the blade settle to the same story, because only then does the geometry feel earned rather than assumed, and only then do we trust the stripe as a charted wake instead of a trick of light. And in that trust, the field becomes navigable in a practical sense, like a channel you know from soundings rather than from guess. I make a small map of the silver. One cut along the stripe from core to edge, another parallel a few arcseconds off to measure background, a suite of profiles to stack and average. The peaks line up with a modest tilt relative to the sun, just where the lane says they should be. A few knots rise above the smooth run, the barbs we guessed might be there. Their spacing fits the idea of grains placed on the water by pulses days apart. It is a simple fit, but a satisfying one, the way a chart and a coastline agree when the fog lifts for a minute and you see the headland exactly where the pencil promised it would be. If we are lucky with time, we revisit the stripe after the crossing. The blade softens to a sheet again. The line relaxes into a plane. The heavy grains keep sliding the channel, fainter now, still obedient to the tide of their launch. Fine spray fades into the wide glare of the normal tail and is lost to weather. We close our notebook with the sense that nothing here was miraculous, because the quiet pleasure of this geometry is that it hides no new rule, only shows an old one from the right ladder at the right moment. And when we climb down again, the wake is still there, broader, dimmer, still true. Night steps toward the rail with us. The field holds a narrow brightness that points the wrong way while obeying every current in sight. The core keeps its small authority at one end of the blade. The sun is off frame, but its logic steers everything we have measured. We slow our walk and stop beside the line, listening to the low, regular water of cooling fans and the far, soft clang of a relay that could be a buoy in an empty roadstead. Then we stand at the frame's edge, where the stripe exits into black, and at the threshold of the dark field, I rest my hand on the frame. I'm writing to you softly, as if with a finger in cool air. We've watched the glow thicken and ease, the light curve find its slow pulse, the dust lay lines we could follow. Tonight, I want to talk about what lives through warmth and what doesn't, when a small, cold thing walks near the sun and tastes its brightness. Some travellers unravel. You've seen the pictures, ragged plumes where a single point used to hold, near-searing sunlight, fast rotation, deep seams filled with volatiles, and a fragile body can fold into mist, the way frost on a window vanishes without a drop. Others hold together, crusted by years, letting only a veil rise before they pass their closest point and drift outward again. The difference is not drama. It is habit and history, written grain by grain. Think of the surface as a tempered shell rather than a brittle skin. Dust and organics can weld into a low, dark crust after long exposure to radiation. That shell is thin, sometimes just centimeters, yet it changes how warmth moves. Heat arrives, pauses in pores, and is kept from the deepest ice by this stony soot. Gas finds narrow exits. The body exhales in threads, not in floods. The halo we see becomes a mist that holds its shape, and the nucleus inside keeps its own. Even a good shell can be fickle at the edge of day. When sunlight leans, ice beneath can rearrange, grains can settle, small bridges of frost can fuse into stronger bonds. Sometimes that makes the surface harder. Sometimes it sets up a later parting. The quiet truth is that survival is not one thing. Size and spin, and where the seam faces the sun, all take their turn. A small object with a swift rotation and a deep pocket of easy ices, is a candidate for unravelling. A stouter body, slower and mantled, may walk through heat with only a thin breath and a patient fade. There are well-kept ledges from other nights. Some comets skated in too near and became only a fan of dust, their cores lost in their own mist. Others, less rash, grew comae and tails, hissed gently for weeks, and then dimmed as if a door had closed. Up close, a craft once found a nucleus, with surfaces dark as cinders and low in heat-taking. It watched jetting as dawn crossed its slopes, and measured how rotation wandered by minutes as seasons changed. Those records are not parables. They're the slow accumulation of how a tempered shell and the mist it makes can carry a body through warmth and back toward the cold. What hardens beyond dust? Time does, and distance. In interstellar night, radiation can stitch simple carbon into longer chains, redden and toughen a surface, make bake-hard varnish out of what began as more delicate frost. Micrometeoroids scuff the topmost film. In the small gravity of a nucleus, those scuffs stay close, becoming part of the cover. You can imagine a long drift transforming a bright crust into something that holds itself together as heat comes and goes, thin, porous, but stubborn enough to keep the inside slow and careful. I want this letter to help you rest, so I'll say the uncertain part in a single, steady breath. Some visitors near the sun break, some hold, and the difference is the sum of many modest strengths adding up, invisible to the eye and audible to us only in the shape of the light. And because we cannot touch the shell, we measure it sideways, in how quickly the coma grows, in whether the brightness follows the same song after closest approach, in how the colour and polarization settle, in the way the spin behaves when the days begin to shorten again. And across those measures, taken without hurry, we learn whether the body has tempered or whether it is still only frost under powder, ready to become mist. In a single warm morning. After the warm edge, survivors share a few habits. The green line often softens. The dusk glow dwindles at a pace set by how much clean ice is left near the surface. The light curve's ripples become quieter as seams seal. Polarization steadies toward values that hint at larger, more compact grains near the core, because the finer spray has thinned. In plots of time since closest approach, this all reads as a downward slope with small rests. You don't need the graph to feel it, though. If you close your eyes and recall the frame, the mist that hung near the core begins to feel thinner in memory, its edges less plush, as if the air between stars were reclaiming what warmth had borrowed. A shell does not have to be strong to be enough. Tens of pascals of cohesion, barely the weight of a sheet of paper on your hand, can keep cliffs and crust in place in low gravity. Cohesion buys time. Time buys paths for warmth to redistribute so that vents do not run away. The mist we read as a coma is not a failed defense. It is a pressure valve working within a narrow comfort. When that valve is many small slits rather than one broad tear, a body endures. When the tear comes first, the body writes itself into space as a fan and is gone. You may be wondering whether a traveller from outside carries a shell more likely to hold. I keep that thought gentle. The long drift can temper a surface, yes. It can also leave it more cracked than crusted. The measure is in the night's data, not in what we hope. We look for consistency rather than spectacle. If counts fall at a patient rate and the curve keeps its period with only humane, small drifts. If the green whispers and then rests instead of flaring, if the dust line grows no sudden knots, we allow ourselves to think the shell has done its work. And if not, we listen kindly to the unravelling and learn what it teaches about stress, spin, and seams. On a last pass through the frame, I make a small note to you alone. Whatever tonight's visitor chooses, mist or temper, unravelling or return, the work remains the same, and the pace remains a comfort. There is no rush here. The sun has its patient clock. The object has its simple answers. We keep watch with steady instruments and quiet hands, and we let the sky finish its sentence before we speak. You can rest your shoulders while it does. The room knows how to hold the silence for you. Night holds the lab like a dim lantern. 2 monitors breathe pale squares into the room. A third keeps time with a quiet status bar. A kettle forgets to boil. I settle a notebook beside the keyboard and let the plots arrive at their own pace. There is no deadline here, only an honest cue. Images to clean, spectra to line up, polarization angles to unwrap. The light from the screens feels cooler than starlight, but it serves the same mercy, just enough glow to work by. A pipeline is a kind of lullaby when it's simple, bias, dark, flat. Astrometry fits, photometry curves. A small routine subtracts a continuum, so the gas has its own lane. Another gathers the rotation phase, so tonight's variables can be folded with last week's. The green channel is tidy after calibration. The ultraviolet proxy waits for its match above the air. On the other display, a draft orbit leans toward openness and stays there. The solver shrugs politely and tries again with the non-gravitational drawer half open. I let it think. Spectra hum at the middle of the table, keystones for the rest. When the mid-infrared panel shows a clean bend where carbon dioxide loves to sing, I mark it. When the band near 4.7 microns answers, I mark that too. If the blue whisper of a certain dissociation song is in the count log, I give it a circle and a note to pair with the dust filters later. The plots aren't loud. They don't have to be. A crisp line has its own warmth when everything around it is quiet. The night shift rhythm is to move laterally, not forward. Images feed profiles that feed polarization, that feeds back into which patches of the coma should be measured again. A knot on the dust blade becomes a timestamp. The timestamp becomes a rotation phase. That phase asks for a second look at a small dip in the curve that seemed like noise until it rhymed with a similar dip 3 nights ago. The tools are plain. A slider for stretch, a checkbox for background windows, a pencil for alignment marks, a hush that keeps the brain from sprinting when the data only wants to walk. I make a short ledger for the traveller, a living note that gathers what the night has earned without decorating it. Coma shape, asymmetric by a gentle margin, steady. Colour, green thread persistent, dust continuum modest, ultraviolet child whispering on schedule. Polarization, negative branch deep enough to suggest fine grains, a small rotational swing. Dynamics, unbound path secure, with small additional push consistent with slow, directional exhale. If the ledger holds over another week, the story will not need adjectives. It will be a diagram of light that tells you who is breathing, how fast, and in which direction the breath leans. Outside, a cooling unit clicks, and the roof's thin skin answers with a soft tick. In here, the code offers a set of residuals tight enough to trust. I test a toy model of jets stitched onto a simple shape and let them push back on the spin by tiny amounts. The period drift the model yields is not a flourish, it is a kindness, because it turns a hazy suspicion into a line you can place next to another line and see that they are the same slope within the patient error bars. And that sameness, quiet, unfussy, repeatable, says more about the surface than any headline could manage on its loudest day. There is time at this hour to pair our small room with larger eyes. A colleague posts a clean image from a big mirror that lived all day in sharp air and now pays us with a deeper dust sheet. Another group's infrared run arrives from a telescope that hears heat where we only see light. An orbit server whispers the same unbound answer in a slightly neater hand. The collaborative page fills at a humane rate, a scroll of steady entries rather than pings. I add a line, not because it changes the world, but because the world gets truer by one quiet line at a time. I like to keep a second ledger for method questions, tiny experiments that fold back into the craft. Does a wider photometric aperture hide a real rotational twitch by smoothing the coma too much? Or does it keep the seeing honest? Does a shorter cadence in the polarimeter make the swing clearer, or only noisier? Which background windows keep the anti-tail profiles faithful when the field is star-rich? They are not glamorous questions, but a night shift lab is built of them, and over many months they become habits. And the habits are the reason the ledger becomes a record you can hand to someone who wasn't here and still let them hear the same song you heard while the fans hummed and the coffee cooled untouched. In the second half of night, the plots feel less like tasks and more like a tide. The narrow band points setting a line that tucks gently into the dust continuum. The rotation phase markers gathering into a small heap of evidence at the same angle. The plane crossing geometry sliding past in slow motion on a window that predicts when the silver blade should be at its thinnest. And beneath all of it a calm arithmetic that never hurries and never lies. So that when the solver says again, with slightly smaller residuals, that the path is open and the feathery push is real, the conclusion feels not like an announcement, but like a page turning in a book that was always this length and no longer. A gentle check for repetition, hooks varied, cadence intact, metaphors tidy and single. Then I anchor the night's ledger with dates and magnitudes and move a handful of plots to the longer archive, where the sequence grows slow muscle. The traveller will go on whether we sleep or stare, but the record is how we travel with it. I save the file and draw one last line under the quiet ledger of light, then dim the screens until the room returns to its bass tone. At 03:26, the cursor blinks once, and the lab remembers how to breathe. You've stayed with a quiet traveller and the small instruments that follow its breath. The story we kept is a simple one, light gathered, cleaned, and compared until the pattern held. A faint halo told us dust was riding out. Rotational ripples in brightness and polarization showed seams on the surface. Narrow filters found a green singer. An ultraviolet ear listened for water's child. Spectra near 4 and 5 microns traced carbon's easier ices. The orbit solver, kept honest by patient astrometry, said the path was open, an unbound curve, with a small, steady push that matched a persistent exhale. Across nights, the silver of a dust sheet sharpened when our viewpoint crossed the plane, a geometry lesson written as a thin line. The negative branch in polarization whispered of fine grains. Later, as the visitor warmed and cooled, the curve steadied toward larger, calmer dust. Whether such a body unravels or endures is not a drama, but a sum of small strengths. A tempered crust, modest vents, and the way heat steps millimeters into porous skin. Many do not survive their nearness to the sun. Some do, fading gently, their ledgers complete. If your eyes are heavy now, you can leave the details in the dark. Keep, if you like, only this. The sky speaks softly and often, and our work is to listen in the same register. Light carries chemistry, curves carry motion, quiet comparisons carry truth. Thank you for letting the room be still enough to hear it. May your breath find the slow cadence of long orbits, and your sleep keep the same steady kindness instruments lend to the night. Good night, and rest well.